Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello, hello. We are live. So, all right. So, looks like we have a couple of folks in the room. So, if you could go to the chat box and just type in your name, so that I know exactly who's in the room, that'll be wonderful. And if you just hit your chat icon, which is the blue icon, you should be able to get into the chat room and just leave your name, and then I'll know who's in the room. Hey, Julie, good to see you. Good to see you. Looking forward to a great conversation, Julie. I cannot hear you. Testing one, two, testing one, two. Hey, Julie. I'm wonderful. I'm wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, we've got about five folks. Yeah. I can't see you, but I can. I do know there's a time delay. The call is a little more in sync than the video. So this will be interesting to see how this time delay works. I have done it before. I have done it before, but usually it's one way, and so folks aren't necessarily, we're not communicating back and forth on the conference call. So, but it'll be great. That might, yeah, that might help. Yay! So how are you? There are. I don't know that I can pull them up here, but I'll certainly send you some. Yeah, and she's not so small these days. 2.5. Yeah, yeah. Oh, cool. Yep. She was. Yeah, she was kind of bouncing around, doing some diversity and inclusion work. That is wonderful. It is. It's very funny how life finds a way, isn't it? One door closes, another opens, and we kind of move on. I see there's another viewer. If you could just go into the chat room, which is that top blue icon on the right side of your screen, and just kind of type your name in so we know who you are. That'll be great. And if you want to call in and have direct conversation, feel free to go to the conference call, which is 651 Well, it's 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. As folks come into the room, they will introduce themselves. Oh, hello, Shannon. How are you? Um, uh, so, as they say where I come from, wherever there's two or three gathered, there will be fun. So we'll go ahead and get started. Now, I'm curious, Julie, what were your uh, what were your hopes for signing up for this conversation? This idea of navigating nonviolently in a trumped up nation. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I will certainly say that I may not be necessarily good at it, but I'm certainly in need of a conversation about it. And I think part of my search and even trying to do this in my research was really that same question. How do I communicate with folks who seem to be almost diametrically opposed to everything that I stand for? And with the understanding that, if I'm not as narcissistic as most of us are, I could try to find some commonalities, but it certainly has been a tough road to find that commonality, or to even understand people's viewpoints. And so I've been trying to figure out how to do that myself. And I stumbled upon nonviolent communication as a way to do that. So that's what I'll be, kind of trying to talk about a little bit as we move through this session. I've got a couple of people trying to log into the call, so we may hear some bleeps or whatnot in the call, but it's we're living in a different kind of world, and we have to do things differently so that we can be effective and not worry or be so concerned with being right. And so this idea of nonviolent communication is my way of trying to adapt in to this new normal, which is, again, quite abnormal in a lot of ways, given how I thought I saw the world and what I thought people were saying to us. And so one of the things that I think is important is this is roughly the state of Minnesota. And I found it very interesting that when I looked at the map of the election, some very profound things stood out for me. And what stood out for me were these shaded areas that were blue areas, and the rest of the state was red. Now, I'm not sure, I'm not 100% on my geography in terms of the creation of this map, but when you look at this map, what stands out for you? What stands out for you? Uh-huh. Yes. Yep. Yeah, well, here's the thing that I thought was very interesting when I looked at this particular piece, and um, folks who are calling in on the conference call, you may want to mute the sound on your computer so you don't get the feedback. But when I looked at this map, what became very obvious to me was that these points are pretty populated, but there are citadels of somewhat higher education, right? So we're looking at Duluth, we're looking at the Twin Cities, we're looking at Rochester, we're looking at Mankato, we're looking at kind of Southwest Minnesota State. So when I saw the map, one of the things that I saw was that there is a disconnect from greater Minnesota, from these kind of ivory towers. And so I believe that for a long time in these ivory towers, we have not been reaching out to greater Minnesota in ways that make sense. And so so I didn't necessarily see the map as being Democrats and Republicans, but I did see it around these urban centers versus these rural areas. And how often do we spend time talking about the Twin Cities because of their population, but often the outlining areas, the greater Minnesota, feels neglected, even if it's not true. They feel neglected given the focus on a number of these different places. And so, when we talk about trying to communicate nonviolently, particularly in this trumped up era, we have to start looking at how we communicate, even with people who we think look like us. Oftentimes in the diversity work that I do, we spend a great deal of time talking about those perceived differences. But the differences that we're now seeing are ideological differences. And so how do you learn how to work with those ideological differences? And so I found looking at this map and looking at it differently, or with a different lens, was actually able to provide me with some opportunities to start thinking about things a little bit differently. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And Shannon, are you on the line? Yes. So Shannon, what were your hopes for this conversation? Why did you hope, or what were you hoping for by joining in this conversation? Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Great. 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 I also, in the link that was sent out to you, did you receive a link for a PDF? Either of you? Okay. All right. Cool. So we'll during the 4 weeks, we'll be kind of marching through that PowerPoint as a reference for our discussions. So I'm glad that you got that, and obviously you can use that at your leisure and share it with friends and whatnot. So before we get to that, I do want to talk a little bit about this idea of human needs. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that again, I'm a diversity and I'm an equity, inclusion, and diversity trainer here in Minnesota. I spend most of my time working with governments, so state and local governments, with their police forces, their social workers, law, the attorneys, the trash collectors. I spend a lot of time working with those government employees so that they can become more effective with the changing and shifting demographics that they're facing. And so to that end, one of the things that is important for us to realize or to recognize is our commonalities and our differences, and how to hold both of those together simultaneously. One of the things that I think you'll pick up in this nonviolent communication resource tool or resource toolkit is being able to hold complex ideas simultaneously. And so when we talk about human needs are wrapped in both those complexities and those simplicities. And so when we talk about human needs, there are three driving factors. And I think Abraham Maslow talked about 5 or 7, depending on what pyramid you're using. But they all boil down to what Alfred Adler would talk about, which are the fact that people are looking for safety, significance, and belonging. And if we look at this idea of significance, people are always or oftentimes trying to demonstrate or even sometimes find their significance. And when we talk about this idea of significance, we're talking about this idea or the sense of purpose, that my existence serves a purpose, that I was born for, I was born on purpose for a reason, and I have something to contribute. And whether that something to contribute is, is anointed, by God, that I understand that, or it's something that I determine for myself, we're all looking for that significance. We're looking for our purpose and demonstrating our purpose, finding our purpose, providing our purpose. And so that's an important thing to think about when we think about human needs. Next is a sense of belonging. And belonging simply says that I want to connect with other human beings who understand or can connect with my purpose. Think about your friends versus your family, but your friends, the people that you choose to be around, the people you choose to hang around, do they recognize your purpose? And the reason I tried to juxtapose family to your friends is that oftentimes family doesn't recognize your purpose, or they believe that your purpose should be something different than what you believe. But your friends, even your colleagues, oftentimes are really centered around this idea of recognizing how they can connect with your significance. What do you think about those two concepts? Do those two concepts make sense as they're related to one another? Or at least if it's not being taken away, they at least feel as though it's being taken away, right? So, yep. So we'll talk about how do we help people get out of that zero sum game, right? That life is a pie, and if I cut up so many pieces, that means that somebody gets left out. When the fact of the matter is, life is not a pie. We don't all want the same things. We don't all expect the same outcomes specifically, but we do have some common yearnings, right? So we'll talk about that. So this idea of significance and belonging, and then lastly is this idea of safety. And safety simply suggests that I am safe to be in relationships with people who understand my significance, whether that is physical safety, emotional safety, spiritual safety, psychological safety, but I'm safe to be in relationships with people who understand my significance. And so when we talk about, what is the some of the deepest needs of human being, it is this idea of safety, significance, and belonging. And so people are currently striving for that in how we communicate. So even if I don't agree with someone, if I can come to that conversation recognizing that these are the goals of their communication, I have a leg up on having a successful interaction with those folks. Now, how we get to those things is determined by two things. One is context, and the other is culture. And these ideas of context and culture are relational, and they are a ratio to one another. And so how people get safety, significance, and belonging is really based on their context and the culture that that has been adapted to the context that they come in, that they live in, right? So for example, I remember, I would imagine that there was a time when um, some of your ancestors may have used another term for Brazil nuts. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? The other term for Brazil nuts? Okay. Yeah. So a Brazil nut is it's like an orange wedge, and it's brown and very crusty and whatnot, a very hard shell. And in the 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe even 60s, it was very commonly known as, or very widely known as, nigger toes. Now, the interesting thing about that is that some folks didn't even know that there was another name for this nut. They called it nigger toes as if that was the scientific name for it, right? Um, and so, why would people use such what we would now call a derogatory term applied to this nut? What do you think, Shannon? Why do you think folks would use that? Yeah, so it was accepted by the context and the culture, right? Now, I will tell you that I don't recall any of my relatives referring to Brazil nuts that way, right? So context and culture have a lot to do with how people get safety, significance, and belonging. And whether I like it or not, these two things, coupled with their desire to get that, may create behaviors that I don't agree with, or that I don't like, patterns of interaction, patterns of living that I can't get with. But that doesn't stop them from being true, or from people trying to achieve those things, right? So that's something to remember, that this idea that people are looking for safety, significance, and belonging, and that the way that they get that is coming directly out of their context and out of their culture. And so if I have a loved one who is using that, what we would call today a derogatory term, I could attack them and say, this is not what we do. We don't call people that anymore. That's such a nasty and dirty term. How effective would that be, particularly for an older person? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. And I would suggest that, again, they may not have come from intentionally, bad or poor intentions. They do have negative impacts on people. Um, and we can also get beyond that, right? So with relationship building, with talking with folks, we can get beyond that. And I think for some of us, with the election of President Donald Trump, that took a lot of people off guard because they weren't ready to have those conversations or even to see the world from someone else's point of view. I found myself and many of my so-called liberal friends acting in ways that are very unbecoming of someone who considers themselves to be a progressive liberal. Resulting to name calling or kind of hate bantering. And one of my friends who is, a peacemonger, if you will, found themselves with road rage against people with certain kinds of bumper stickers, right? And that is that's interesting because that shows us who we are in a number of important ways. So I think that's very important. One of the things that I've come to with understanding or even trying to talk about nonviolent communication is this idea that I have to. So I made a Facebook post, and some folks didn't get it, and I understand why they may not have gotten it, mostly because they didn't want to get it. But I told some Facebook friends that there are no trees. No, there is no forest, is what I said. There is no forest. There are only trees. And what I meant by that particular comment was that we may want the world to be a certain way, or we may try to see it a particular kind of way, but we have to take it for what it is. And so when trying to figure out what was going on with this, with a nation where the people who voted were split by 51 and 49%, respectively. But there was a whole nother group of 15% who voted for a third-party candidate, and then a whole huge body of electorate that did not vote. And so I'm trying to understand a number of things, why folks didn't vote, and the folks who didn't vote the way that I would have thought that they would or should or whatnot. And so really trying to try to figure all that stuff out. And then I just came to a point where I was like, I can't think the way other people think, and I can't expect to understand their motivations. So I have to take this as it is. And so after going through a short grieving process, I came to see that I have to accept what it is as opposed to the way I want it to be. And so for me, that's where this nonviolent communication became at least a useful tool. I'm not suggesting that it is the tool, but it's certainly a tool that we can use to be helpful in this conversation. So let's back up just a little bit and talk about this idea of violence. Now, when violence is enacted, what is the emotional residue left over by violence? So we can talk about post-traumatic stress. We can talk just about we could just talk about the emotions that come up even from childhood violence, right? So I don't know if you've ever, had a violent act imposed on you as a small child, but what are the emotions that come up when that happens? Yeah, shame, fight or flight, betrayal, disappointment, disbelief. I would also say, anger. We talked about this resentment, this idea of resentment, hostility, revenge. Typically, all of these are kind of boiling after a physical violence has been has occurred, either on the victim's part or even on the perpetrator, right? So when we talk about this idea of disrespect, what is the emotional residue of being disrespected? That in many cases, and I think you're right, you hit the nail right on the head, that disrespect in and of itself is an act of violence. So when I taught high school, one of the most, if you really wanted to get in trouble in my classroom, one of the things you could do was tell one of your peers to shut up. In my opinion, that's one of the most disrespectful things that you can say to an individual, right? That the words that are coming out of your mouth are of so little value, I don't want you to utter them, right? And so when we talk about this idea of nonviolent communication, it really is boiling down to this idea of being respectful. And I don't have to like people or what they say to be respectful to and of them. And so when we start down this road of nonviolent communication, we're actually talking about how to be respectful to folks. Now, here's the trick about respect. It's easy to respect someone who respects you back. That's an easy thing to do. That's pretty common that people are able to do that. But it takes a certain kind of person and a special mentality and way of seeing the world to be respectful in the face of disrespect. So there's a story I often tell in many of my sessions, and if you've heard this story before, just bear with me. There are folks who haven't yet, right? So I go into a restaurant. It's a Saturday to just kind of grab some lunch. So it's right around noonish, 1 o'clock ish, and I walk into this kind of bar restaurant. I go up to the bar to order my lunch. And at the end of the bar is a guy who's red-faced and drunk. So he's just inebriated. Now, I know a few things about this guy, given the fact that it's such an early part of the day to be so inebriated. One is that he's probably a regular. And secondly, he feels like this is probably his home, right? And so I close my menu, and the gentleman moves from the end of the bar and sits right next to me. And, I don't know about you, but I know that drunk people are unpredictable. So I'm mentally trying to prepare myself for anything. And so we start our conversation like any good Minnesotan would. And we start talking about the weather. And so we're talking about weather and all this kind of stuff. And then it gets a little political. And then he breaks out with his thesis. The reason I believe he sat next to me. And he says to me, I don't like niggers. Now, to me, I'm like, that's one heck of an introduction. And so I do what any good Minnesotan would do when we're uncomfortable. What do we try to do? We try to change the subject. So I tried to change the subject to talk about something different, but there's a voice that says, a voice in my head or in my heart that said, go back to that. Go ask him some questions about that. So I say, sir, when you use that word, what are you talking about? And he says, I'm talking about people on welfare, people who are undereducated, people who, try to use the system, people who aren't working, blah, 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 blah. And so I said to him, sir, do you know of any white people who fit that description? And he looks at me and he says, yeah. I said, how about those Vikings? So we start talking about the Vikings and we talk about sports and all sorts of stuff. And then he leans over to me. He said, you know what? I don't like niggers, but I like you. Now I'm really kind of conflicted because he's going back to a word that he knows, right? And so I said, well, sir, what if all the people that you have met that you think look like me, all the ones that you've met that you think look like me, were idiots, and everybody else that you don't know that is like me is just like me? And so he looks at me and he says, I gotta pee. So he gets up and he goes off to the restroom. Now, while he's up at the restroom, my food comes, I get my tab, and I'm headed out the door. As I'm heading towards the door, guess who meets me at the door? It's this guy. And his hair's been combed over. He's got water driplets on his face, and he hands me a damp napkin. And with that napkin is his telephone number. He says, I raise chickens. If you ever need fresh eggs, give me a call. I take the damp napkin. I go my way. He goes his way. I never call the guy, right? What happened in that interaction? I challenged his beliefs by giving him a counterexample. What else? Yeah, and if I had attacked or gotten defensive by his use of words that I don't necessarily believe apply to me, what would that have done for him? Right? It would have certainly reinforced everything that he thought he knew about people who he thinks look like me. And so one of the things that I learned early on is that oftentimes it's better to be effective than to be right. Because I could have corrected that guy and said, look, you don't call people by that name. You don't, I don't know, where you think you come from. I'm going to give you a piece of my mind and blah, 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 blah. I could have went down that path, but that would not have necessarily changed anything about how he saw the world or how he saw people who he thought looked like me. And so I had to show him respect in the face of disrespect. Now, I don't know who all was watching that interaction. I don't know what other people were thinking, but I would imagine that there was an atmosphere change by my response to what this man said. And so as a lot of times we want to be right, or we want to be disrespected, and not recognizing that we can be a bridge and not just a doormat. And I find it interesting that people will say, well, you shouldn't let people walk all over you. I've certainly heard people say that. But then when I think about what that means, I get really confused, because most of the houses that I go to, either to visit or places of business, they all have doormats. They all have doormats. So what is the purpose of a doormat? The doormat is designed to make sure that when you go past the doormat, your shoes are cleaner than they were before you got there. So even doormats serve a purpose. And lastly, secondly, this idea of a bridge. All the verbs that apply to a doormat can also apply to a bridge. It's designed to get you from one place to another. And so so those are some important things to kind of think about. And so when we talk about, one of the things that's also important for me to realize or to recognize is that I need for Donald Trump to have some measure of success. I need that to happen. I need for him to have some measure of success. And I'll kind of talk about my threshold of what success would be for President Donald Trump. Because I don't necessarily agree with all of the stances that he takes and all the positions, but I do know that he is the pilot of a plane that I'm on. And I don't want the plane to crash. I don't want the plane to crash. So there's a measure of success. And so what are some of the things that I need President Trump to be successful in? One is this idea of not getting into any more wars, or particularly a third world war. So if he can keep us out of a third world war, success. I consider that success. If he can, avoid a financial collapse, I consider that success, right? That the U.S. dollar doesn't go down any further. That we're not. Other countries are accepting our currency. If he can keep that going, then I would say we have a measure of success. That we're not turned into an authoritarian state, that would be success for me, right? That he doesn't turn this into an authoritarian state. That that we don't abandon the intent and the purpose of the Constitution. That would be a success for me. And then lastly, he would, I will have seen President Trump as being successful if he could actually heal a number of the wounds that were brought up by Secretary Clinton and candidate Trump in that election cycle. There was a lot of hurt and damage done during that cycle that has just been exacerbated through this presidency thus far. And so if he can figure out a way to heal those things and, not get us into a world war, not alienate us from all of our allies, that our economy doesn't tank, those would be things that I would find to be successful. There's certainly other things and higher ideals that one would seek to have, but given the nature of this particular individual and the rhetoric, those higher aspirations and all that kind of stuff, I'm not necessarily looking for those things. I just don't want this particular pilot to crash a plane that I'm on. Any thoughts about that? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. 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 So these are the kinds of conversations that we have to have outside of our circles, right? So because to be quite honest, there are people who don't think that he's drunk, who think that he is flying this plane in the right direction, and that he is he is doing all of the right things. So really trying to find those commonalities when we go back to this idea of trying to figure out what is versus what we want, right? Um, those are, yeah. Well, I would submit that I believe that a number of those folks have been having these conversations long before this particular president has been elected. So, and I'm gonna step out on a branch, and I'm gonna risk alienating some folks, but the folks who who felt disenfranchised from the era of the Obama administration felt that before Obama took office, were indulged while he was in office, and became vocal as they saw an opportunity to make sure that he could never get in office again, right? These are the same folks who believe in terms like reverse discrimination. Many of these folks also believe that there is specific religious persecution of Christians happening here in the United States. The problem I see with where we are now is that I could have never reached or talked to those individuals before our current state. But there are individuals who were in their families, in their lives, who could have talked to them, who could have created some cognitive dissonance for them to say, that's not really how the world is. But to keep peace in these small pieces of the world, they elected to be silent in the face of this obtuse and irresponsible way of looking at the world. And so I think a Saturday Night Live skit, said it very well. I think it was Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle were watching the election, right? And so there were all of these so-called liberals who were really shocked by this outcome, and they couldn't believe that the situation was, what it was. And one question was, I can't believe that racism still exists. And Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock just kind of smiled, and they laughed because they've known this for a long time. And so I would say, that it has become more important now that people have conversations with people who look like them, because these are conversations that should have happened a long time ago. Yep. And here's the interesting thing. There's not one approach. It's not one conversation. And it's not even about having a conversation. It's about being the conversation everywhere that you go. Right. So, it's interesting to me that I get invited places either to speak or to participate in activities, and they know what they're getting. They know that they're getting Andre the diversity trainer dude. And so with that comes all the challenges of inviting me to a place. I may in fact speak up in ways that are uncomfortable. I found that right after the election, I was invited to Thanksgiving dinner, and I told myself that I'm going to be good because I was the only black guy there, and I did not want to be the one to ruin Thanksgiving. And so I decided I'm not going to say anything. And I left with a bleeding tongue because there was all of this stuff that was flying all around, and I chose not to engage. Hindsight is always 2020, right? I should have stood up and said something. I should have made people uncomfortable. I should have engaged people in critical thought because I was not going to have that chance again. And so yeah, that very well could be true. Um, I guess what I'm suggesting is that both we need to challenge folks in ways that they can hear us, but we can't keep allowing people to live another. Here's another example, right? So there's a photo floating around, social media, of all of these charred bodies, and there's some caption that says, the massacre of Christians continues, or something to that effect, right? I have to say something. So I go to Snopes, and I go to other places where you find out about fake news, and I put that together. And every time I see that picture, I tag it with that information. And those people who actually who want to be enlightened, who want to be engaged, who have the right motives for communicating, they change their picture. However, if I had never put anything up, they would have never changed it, right? So it's really about doing both of those. And I'm not suggesting yelling at people and all sorts of stuff. And let me tell you, protesters have their place, and I'm glad they're doing their job because they make it a lot easier for me to do mine. So people are like, they're yelling and screaming, and I say, all right, then come over here, let's sit down and let's have a conversation, right? So but I think too often, particularly my white brothers and sisters, have taken the path of least resistance, and it has produced what we have today. Yes, that's right. Yep, 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 that's right. Nope. No. And I don't think anybody, I don't think it's anyone's expectation that you do that, but that you do speak from your own, right? And so when we go back to this idea of safety, significance, and belonging, when I'm talking to folks who are diametrically, who I feel are diametrically opposed to me, I have to ask myself, why do they feel that way? What are they trying to get by thinking or feeling or acting that way? And the safety, significance, and belonging. So then I go into the mode of, are there other ways that I can help them to get safety, significance, and belonging differently than the way they've been getting it, or the way that they think they've been getting it? And so, so that's where this nonviolent communication, this compassion, this way of trying to actually hear people, comes in as a way to try to do that. But it can't be a one-time shop. It can't. And one of the things that I also recognize is that this is a muscle that you have to train, right? You have to build this muscle. So it doesn't mean you get it right every time, but it does mean you keep trying to get it right. It doesn't mean that, you understand, or you engage in the perfect conversation every time, but you engage in a conversation so that muscle gets strengthened. And because for too many of us, are not only our critical thinking, but our ability to engage in critical conversation is in a state of atrophy, right? And so we got to keep building that muscle and working on that, and we won't get it right, which is why I like this idea of nonviolent communication. And it has its limits. It is a tool. It is not the tool. It has its limits. So let's talk a little bit about nonviolent communication. I think we have about half hour left or so. So we'll kind of get into it. So the nonviolent communication basically is broken down into two parts. It is the process, and then it is also understanding who we are as individuals. And so it's difficult to communicate with someone when they're going to push your buttons. And so what do you do if you know someone's going to push your buttons? Well, what's the easiest way to communicate with them, particularly if you have an idea that they're going to push your buttons? Yeah. Yep. Uh-huh. Yep. Yep. Shannon, what do you think? Mm-hmm. And it may very well be, right? So we know that our need for significance, safety, and belonging didn't start when we turned 25. We, so our adolescent, our child who didn't have a whole lot of power and influence, figured out ways to get the safety, significance, and belonging. And if it's been working for us, we keep using that same skill until it no longer works for us, or until we realize. So this idea of manipulation or cunning or cuteness or whatever, it's worked for us. So we're gonna keep doing it, right? The I think the easiest way is to not have buttons. So I do my best, particularly, like I gave that scenario of the restaurant, right? So that guy, I believe he was really trying to push a button with the recognition that that kind of stuff can happen often, or has happened to me in the past, or will happen in the future. I have removed that as a button. So I will tell you, there are things that get me riled up, that get me upset, that tick me off. But as much as I can, I try to remove as many of those buttons as possible, right? So you mess with an underdog, a child, an animal. You're hurtful to them in any kind of way, and I'm on it. But any personal attacks you have against me, or things you want to say about me, I'm not. I know who I am because I've removed some of those buttons, right? So that's the first part. Yes, go ahead. I recognize that so one thing that I started to recognize is that what other people think about me is none of my business. So however they see the world has nothing to do with me. How they get their safety, significance, and belonging, the context that they come from, the culture that they grew up with, I have no influence on. All the decisions that they've made about how they want to interact with the world were made long before they met me. And so my only job is to interact with them, and in some cases hope that my interaction flies in the face of what they grew up learning about people. So I don't actually change people, but I invite them to change because I invite them to get to know who I am. And so so removing those buttons, so I know the kinds of things that can make me angry. So I have to ask myself, what is it about the thing that makes me angry? Is it the thing itself, or is it that someone's trying to embarrass me? Right. So my daughter fell off a chair at church, and there's a whole group of people around, and she was just being clumsy. She was just playing around being clumsy, and she fell off the chair. And I asked her, I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Yes, I'm okay." I said, "Are you embarrassed?" She said, "Yes, I'm very embarrassed." She's crying as if she was hurt, and to see the people around her, they thought that there was something physically wrong with her, when in fact it was just she was upset by her embarrassment. Maybe I led her into saying that she was embarrassed, maybe some other things, but what I wanted her to recognize was that her physicalness did not have to determine these other pieces, right? And so we have to recognize, what is it about our interaction that when people disrespect us, I recognize that my first place is to feel violated, or to feel the impacts of violence. And so I have to check that's a self-actualization piece that I have to do myself, that nobody can ever do for me. Because if I don't realize because one of the things that disrespect does, it makes me feel a certain kind of way, but it doesn't reduce my bank account. It doesn't make me any less attractive. It doesn't reduce my skill to communicate to people in positive, dynamic ways. And so and again, I'm not over that in every area of my life. There are certain things that I'm pretty good about this. I've removed those buttons. You can't tick me off doing that. But there are other things that I'm still working on, right? And there are things that get me upset, particularly around injustice and particularly as the underdog piece that we talked about just a little while ago. And so trying to remove those buttons is extremely important, because my communication isn't necessarily about. So here's a couple of things that nonviolent communication gets into, and it looks like next week we'll get into more of the outline. But I don't know if you've ever had these conversations with folks, but there are 3 levels of conversations that we're typically talking about. One is the emotion. Bye bye, Minnesota. So we're talking about the emotion, right? So in our conversation, how do you feel? And how do you feel about me? How do you feel about us? What's the emotional state of what's the emotional risk that I can take in this conversation? So we're talking, one level of conversation is the emotion. The second is the actual thing that we're talking about, right? So what is it that we're really talking about? Is it, is it about where we want to go ahead? I'm talking about content, right? So what is the content or the thing that we're talking about? So, and I'll give some examples of that in just a second. And then the third is the relationship, right? So here's an example of these three and how they can be convoluted. Or the convolution that can happen when we're not clear about what's going on. Now, remember, these three things are also related to these three things. So someone says, where do you want to go to dinner? And when you're dating somebody, what usually is the answer to that? Where do you want to go, right? So where do you want to go to get dinner? Where do you want to go? What are they trying to figure out? They're trying to figure out one of these three things, right? So because if somebody says, I want to go to Spaghetti Factory, and the other person's like, I hate spaghetti, might they go to the Spaghetti Factory anyway? Yes, why? Because it's tied to the relationship, or it's tied to the emotion, or the emotion is the feeling is at risk, and I don't want to risk this relationship over going to eat spaghetti, right? And so, or somebody will say, well, how do I look in this outfit? Oh, so loaded. Because what are we talking about? Are we really talking about the outfit? Are we talking about the relationship? Are we talking about the feelings? Do I want to take that risk? What's going on, right? So when we're talking with people who we believe are diametrically opposed to us, these are some of the things that we have to recognize. Now, if we want to ditch any of this stuff, if I don't have a relationship with somebody, I'm certainly going to talk to them differently than I would if I'm in a relationship with someone. If I see everyone as my brother and sister, if I see everyone as an opportunity to grow and change through my conversations, I certainly am going to build a different kind of relationship with them and have a different kind of conversation. The things that I talk about with them, I'll talk about those things very differently than I would if I didn't have a relationship with them. And how I feel about them would be very different given the relationship. And so given the complexity of these things and recognizing that these things are also happening, when we talk about nonviolent communication, we really can bring those things together to at least as a communicator, even if the person you're communicating with doesn't get all of this stuff, they don't recognize all this stuff, they're participating, but as the actionable communicator, if you can keep these things in mind, you can actually lead people to having some critical conversations that actually change how they think and how they see the world. Does that stuff make sense? I'm sure that's stuff you've heard before, right? Good. Yeah. So I'm just going to read a couple of pieces of from nonviolent communication, and you'll also find these in your workbook. Nonviolent communication is a process we focus in the nonviolent communication process. We focus on the light of consequences in 4 areas, referred to as the 4 components of nonviolent communication. 1 is the concrete actions we are observing that are affecting our well-being. We first observe what is actually happening in situations. What are we observing in others? What are they saying? What are they doing that either enriches our life or does not enrich our life? The trick is to be able to articulate this observation without introducing any new judgment or evaluation. And so first we have to look at what is as opposed to what we want it to be. So when my partner asked me, how do I look in this dress? The first thing I have to do in nonviolent communication is answer that first part of the question for myself. How does she look in that dress? Is that the right color for her? Is that the right tone? Does that fit her shape? I have to look at that first before I go to these other places, right? The second thing in nonviolent communication, how we feel in relation to what we are observing is the next state that we must take action upon. Are we hurt? Are we scared? Are we joyful? Are we amused? Are we irritated? And one of the things that oftentimes happens, particularly for human beings, and I would say for males, only because research demonstrates this, that men typically use less words than women. But I would even say that even women are limited in the emotional words that we can use to describe how we feel. And so it's important for us to recognize the importance of expanding our vocabulary of how we feel so that we can more accurately communicate what those feelings are to other people and actually recognize them for ourselves. The third is the needs, values, and desires that are creating our feelings. We say that these needs occur and they're connected directly to our feelings and our identity, right? So now we're really talking about this idea that our needs, our values are really connected to our identity. And they don't have to be, but typically they are connected to our identity when we're not mindful or thoughtful. And then fourthly, the concrete action or the request we have in order to enrich our lives must be clear and demonstrative. And so in nonviolent communication, not only am I looking at these three dimensions, but the fourth dimension is actually making a declaration of what I want or how I want to be in relationship or in communication with this other person. And so that's where lots of I statements come in and how we hope to engage people in some productive ways. Any questions about those 4 points? Okay, yep. All right, cool. Just a couple of other things, and again, you'll find this also in the PDF. Is this idea of our intentions in communicating, and we have to be cognizant of our own intentions as we seek to communicate with other people. So, is it our intention to actually have conversations about things, or is our conversation to use our intellect and our power to overpower someone's thinking in order to get them to change their behavior in a particular kind of way? And I think that's a place where lots of liberals have gotten caught. Lots of folks say that they're into diversity and inclusion, and they want to be open to all ideas, except for those ideas that disagree with what they see as their particular worldview. And so, and I think without that awareness of this tension of being aware of our intentions, we end up acting in ways that we would shun from anyone else who was acting that way. And so I think that's important to recognize what is our intention in communicating. Is it to actually change someone's opinion, or is it to conversation with no hopes, or is there something very specific that I'm trying to do through my communication? Um, and the yes. Yeah, yeah, and what I would say is so Alfred Adler talks about this concept of spitting in someone's soup, and that's a pretty violent activity, right? Um, but when that happens, I mean, I don't know if you can envision, you having a bowl of soup, and you're talking to somebody, and they just kind of they spit in your soup. What does that engender? What does that metaphor engender? What happens? It's a turn off. It's a put down. But what if you really like this person, right? So at that point, you have choices to make, right? And what are the choices that you have to make? Yep, it could be drawing your boundaries, and that's a boundaries question. Yeah, yeah. Or another way. So let's find one that's not as dramatic, but a fly in your suit, right? So you have a fly in your suit. The fly lands in your soup. Well, what's next? All right, so you might pick it up. Yep, you have choices. Yeah, the basic concept is not to incite violence or anything like that, but it really is to stir people to a point that they recognize that they have choices in their behavior, right? So for example, all the best crime dramas who have courtroom antics, the all the best attorneys will ask a question, and then when challenged on that question, withdraw the question from the record. Why is that? They put it out there. And what did they put? Right, because people are now thinking about it, right? And so that at yep, absolutely correct, right? And what I would say is the state of things as they are now is because we haven't had enough people consistently having those conversations, even if they weren't going to win the conversation. Just bringing up these topics of justice, or these topics of the truth about reverse discrimination, or the truth about religious oppression of Christians. Just having the conversation in and of itself, whether there is a positive outcome or you have the best argument or not, I believe if more people had those conversations ahead of time, the world that we live in right now would be much, much different. And many of us have been waiting for the right thing, or having the right answer, or having the right argument, when that's not how life doesn't. There is no perfect time to get married. There's no perfect time to have children. There's no perfect time to get a dog. There's no perfect time to move. There's no perfect time to get a graduate degree. I mean, life doesn't. There's no. That's not how life happens, right? But when we get nervous and we get scared about how to have these difficult conversations, those are the kinds of psychic crutches that we use to try to explain or rationalize why we don't move in situations that we know that we can or we should. And so hopefully in these next 3 weeks, we'll go through more of this nonviolent communication so that we can see and build those skills to be actionable and invite others to the conversation. Yeah, so here's the funny thing. I have so on Facebook, I make it a point to have friends that I agree with and to have people that I don't agree with. I refer to those people as my frenemies. And so I don't go around trying to pick fights with folks, but more often than not, when important issues come up, you would be very surprised at how I thought I was like-minded with these individuals, but that their nuanced perspectives may actually provide for some really good conversation. And in many cases, when I stand up for the silent view or the opposing view, just in situations where we're just having conversations, right? Where we're not really trying to get a whole lot of work done, or is stakes are high, low stakes, game night or whatever. It is interesting that even with people who are so-called like-minded, when you engage in real and meaningful conversation, you might be surprised at how those views differ from what you thought they would or should. So yes, you do have to get outside of your comfort zone, and oftentimes be in circles that you're you may feel outnumbered or not a part of what's going on. Here's a good example. I would imagine that we were part of a group that met on, what was it, Thursdays for breakfast. And I would imagine that out of that group, we all thought we were pretty like-minded, but given some real tests of what that like-mindedness might look like, we might be surprised at how different we saw the world. We also might be surprised at who our allies are in terms of people who do see the world like us. During this whole election process, I was actually surprised at people that I found to be allies that before I was like, I can't get with that person. I don't know what's wrong with them or whatever. But as a part of seeing and growing myself, I've really been able to see their points of view and realize that we have a lot more in common than I thought we did when when I didn't have to look for those commonalities, you know? So so the PDF, the cover of the PDF looks like this. So I'll make sure that everybody gets a copy of the PDF. And again, we're just going for 4 weeks. This comes directly out of Nonviolent Communication Companion Workbook. So just to kind of go over the agenda, part one is that we'll kind of deal with the mechanics of speaking peace, communication that blocks compassion. We'll talk about that. Observing without evaluating, identifying and expressing our feelings, and then taking responsibility for how we feel and how we see things is the root. That, and then requesting that which would enrich our lives. That will be part one. And so next week we'll address part one of this of the workbook. And so I'm so excited. Thank you so much for joining in the conversation. If you have questions offline, feel free to email me, and you can email me at andre@amhorizons.com. And you will all get an email from me just to make sure that you get the PDF. So I'll make that in the notes, as well as a personal email from me. Anything that you, any questions that you have at this point, or things that you're hoping that we will cover that outline may not have addressed? Okay, so with that, we'll wrap up this session, and I'll see you guys next week. And during the week, if you have any great antidotes or things that come up based on some of the things that we've talked about, please feel free to send those to me. My name is Andre Cohen. Thank you so much for joining us for Nonviolent Communication in our Trumped Up Nation. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you so much. Have a great night. Goodbye. All righty. Good night.